as relations between the US and China and Europe continue to deteriorate and sour, you could make the argument that even if China's global economic interaction decreases, these regions of Africa and the Middle East will become even more important.
My name is Jace White, Program Officer at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I'm pleased to introduce our guests for today's interview about China's engagement with the Global South, particularly with Africa and the Middle East. Dawn Murphy is Associate Professor of National Security Strategy at the U.S. National War College and the author of the new book, China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and Beijing's Alternative World Order. Her research lies in the nexus between domestic and global politics and the intersection of economics and security in Asia. Moderating the interview will be Lina Benabdallah, an assistant professor at Wake Forest University. Lina is also a research associate with the Johns Hopkins University China-Africa Research Initiative, a senior associate with the Africa program of the Center for Strategic International Studies, and a contributing editor for Africa is a Country. Both Dawn and Lina are also fellows in the National Committee's Public Intellectuals program. We would also like to note that the views expressed today in this interview are those of the author, Dawn Murphy, and do not reflect the official policy or position of the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. With that said, over to you, Lina.
Thank you so much for the introductions, and thank you to the National Committee for the opportunity to read Dawn's book and to have a moment to sit down with her and ask her some questions about her wonderful research. So the book, as mentioned just in the introduction, is titled China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and Beijing's Alternative Order. It was published this year by Stanford University Press. The book is a very important contribution to scholarship on China's foreign policy making, China's relations with the Global South, and should be of interest to all students and scholars studying and observing Chinese foreign policy making, as well as scholars and practitioners who are interested in U.S.-China relations. So while doing the research for the book, Dawn had secured multiple grants and sources of funding to do an impressive amount of field research spanning well over 10 countries. I think I counted 13, and more than 200 interviews. So it's very exciting to me to dive into our conversation and discussion on the book and expand on this wealth of empirical evidence and rich fieldwork experience. So I'm really excited about this, and I want to welcome Dawn to the conversation. So good afternoon, Dawn. How are you?
Good, and thank you to the National Committee for having me. And Lina, thank you so much for taking time to read the book and having this discussion today.
Wonderful. So just let's get started right away with just a question on sort of the main arguments of the book. Dawn, you write that ultimately, while China is not seeking to redraw the geopolitical map, it's not seeking to recreate a revisionist new world order, as it were, it's still interested in constructing a new or an alternative order by building its own spheres of influence, by creating its own influence in the Global South. So can you please just explain to our listeners a little bit how these the two things are different, and if you can just tell us a little bit about how, to what extent, and whether Beijing has been successful in achieving this goal.
So as you had said, the book does argue, as opposed to when you look at Asia, where there's a number of unresolved territorial disputes, whether that be around Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, or the border with India. In the Middle East and Africa, China doesn't have territorial aspirations, and a lot of that's speaking to the broader rising power literature. So what I do argue is that increasingly, China is competing with the US and the West, building spheres of influence, and challenging the international system through building an alternate order in various ways. And for the listeners, just to give you an idea of when I talk about an alternate order, some of the components of this would be the cooperation forums, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, as well as the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. Some other elements that would be included would be special economic zones, agricultural demonstration centers, free trade agreements, strategic partnerships, foreign aid programs, as well as Belt and Road broadly defined. So there's many different elements of this order. What I'd really point out to you is that there is a real divergence in the behavior by functional area. In the political realm, economics and foreign aid, you increasingly see China competing with the US and its behavior sometimes being in alignment with the liberal order and sometimes diverging. But in the security sphere, the vast majority of behavior is both cooperating with the US and the West, as well as converging and in alignment with the liberal order. To the second part of your question regarding whether China's achieving its objectives through this alternate order, I would look at that interest by interest, right? So I consider China's most important interest to be accessing resources and markets in these regions. So these various elements of that order very much facilitate that. And you see a dramatic increase in that type of activity. So I would say they've been relatively successful on that front. Another major objective is fostering support for China in the broader international system. And when you look at the 53 countries in Africa that are part of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or you look within the Middle East, in many different international forums, those countries are supporting China. To what degree is that because of these alternate elements of order versus shared interests? We could discuss that for a very long time, but I do think these elements of order actually contribute to China soliciting support from countries in these regions in a coordinated way. So I would say they've been relatively successful on that. Another element of their interests would be having relative silence regarding what is occurring in Xinjiang. And you've seen on a number of occasions statements that have come out that countries in these regions have been supportive of China in that regard as well. So I think it's been relatively successful in relation to that interest. Another interest would be protecting Chinese citizens and businesses abroad. And we'd have to get into the real details of some of these mechanisms, but I think you could argue China's been relatively successful on that front. So if you think about what China's interests are in these regions and judge success in that way, I would say they've been quite successful.
Yes, thank you so much for these thorough responses. So since the book is about China, Global South, but specifically looking at the Middle East and Africa, of course, my follow-up question here is to dig a little bit into that. So the Global South is a huge space. It's a big, as you were mentioning a little bit earlier, different areas, different functionalities, different states will have different various outcomes and as well as interests in their relations with China. So walk us through maybe the way you reached basically a decision to look at these two regions, to the Middle East and to Africa. And you do detail in the book quite thoroughly the reason why the Global South is important to understand. So when we're trying to observe and understand and study China, it's not important, it's not necessary, it's not sufficient to only look at directly US-China or China-Global North relations. It's extremely important to see everything that's happening. And it is something that I also argue in my research. It is very important to look at what China is doing in the Global South to have a better picture and a better understanding of China's foreign policy making. It's not just towards the US or other Global North states. So while I agree with that completely, and now here the question is, so, why not South America or Southeast Asia or other, regions within the Global South, especially knowing, in scholarship, when we read about China's financial commitments, for instance, in Africa, and something you document very well in the book, Africa doesn't necessarily come up as a huge area of influence for China, right? It tends to be marginal in terms of China's financial interests or investments or foreign aid commitments even. So tell us why it's important to learn about China's foreign policy in these two particular regions that you focused your book on.
So when I originally started the research for this book, which would have been in the late 2000s, there was a real lack of comprehensive scholarship on China and the Middle East in particular, and there was a growing body of work on China and Africa. So as you said, one of my concerns was in discussing and thinking about China's rising power, too much of the literature was looking at China and Asia or at bilateral US-China relations. So I wanted to expand the discussion beyond that. The reason I picked these specific regions was one, that I did want to focus on the Middle East, and I wanted to look at two regions, two large regions. One similarity between these regions is they're both resource rich, right? So I thought it was interesting to think about looking at these two resource rich areas that had a history of great power competition in them, granted between different great powers at different points in time, but that had these legacies. So wanting to look at two regions that were similar in that way, but also that had differences. So the Middle East being a region of the world where the US has vital interests, and arguably Africa being a region of the world where it does not, for example. Africa having many more developing countries than, especially in the Gulf, looking at the Middle East in that way. So I wanted to look at the similarities and differences between these two regions. So that was not to say that Latin America or Central Asia, et cetera, weren't important. To your point on investment, more broadly, I do think this is a misconception in a number of ways, and you're absolutely accurate. For example, when you look at foreign direct investment, really the top destination is Hong Kong, and much of that is round tripping back into China. And then it's Asia, and then it's Europe, and then it's North America. And then you start getting into Middle East, Africa, Latin America, these other regions. And in all of the regions that I just mentioned, the numbers are quite small compared to others. So I'm not trying to imply that Africa is the most important region for China. I just thought it was analytically important to look at it in comparative perspective, especially because many of the foreign policy tools that are used in these regions are also used in other regions around the world. So that was the primary driver. One other piece is that the Middle East is an area where historically the US, at least in recent history, has considered it part of its sphere of influence, where again, Africa, not as much. So I do think that adds some different analytical angles in trying to think through what that means for China's behavior.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with the argument that Africa is analytically important to understand what is going on in terms of China's projection of power and built-in power, and that adds a very important piece to the puzzle. And I most certainly appreciate that Africa is part of the analysis that you chose to include in the book. So as a kind of a follow-up to this question, in a way, I wanted to ask, is China's foreign policy, the tools, interests deployed in these two regions, are they the same? Are they different? What is your assessment in terms of specifically the differences that you might have observed in the way that China, Beijing, conducts its foreign policy in the Middle East versus in Africa? Are there specific things that you can highlight for our listeners, maybe areas where you can point out the divergence or the different tools that are used, or maybe if there are different interests that Beijing is pursuing in this region and not the other? Thank you.
So as you said, there's a lot of consistency. Many of the tools and the interests are the same. So as I said earlier, access to resources and markets, that's true of both. Wanting to have support in the international system from countries in both, that's consistent. The piece about Xinjiang and the need to have relative silence, I would say that's more important in the Middle East than in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So that would be one differentiator. Another differentiator would be that in Sub-Saharan Africa, and my work looks at Sub-Saharan Africa versus Middle East, broadly defined, including North Africa. I know there's many different ways in which to conceptualize these regions, but it does frame it in that way. So looking at Sub-Saharan Africa versus the Middle East, there is more of a focus on foreign aid, on concessional loans. And when you look at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation versus the Arab States Cooperation Forum, a lot more rhetoric and verbiage associated with developing country causes and South-South solidarity and that type of emphasis. So that would be one difference, as you see that more in Sub-Saharan Africa. Another difference is that China sees the Middle East as an area of instability and fears interstate conflict much more in that region versus Sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got more of a worry regarding China having a balanced approach among the various countries in the region, whether that be the Arab states, Iran, Israel, Turkey, etc. Much more of an emphasis on that, as opposed to you don't see that as much in Sub-Saharan Africa. As I said before, China is much more sensitive in the Middle East to US influence. So part of what I would argue is that the tools are the same, the content is the same, but in Sub-Saharan Africa and in the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, you have a lot more, I think, willingness on the part of China to publicize the activities and to try to take credit for the activities, even though in many ways they are exactly the same. Another difference between the two would be an emphasis in the Middle East on support for the Palestinians, which since 1992, China has had robust, strong ties with Israel and very much presents itself as a balanced actor in the region regarding this issue. But because it is an important issue for the League of Arab States and for many Arab states more broadly, there is more of an emphasis on that. So for example, when China pursues a free trade agreement with Israel, it also pursues one with Palestine, just as an example. And finally, when you look even at the cooperation forums, they treat the regions a bit differently in that FOCAC includes all of the countries on the continent of Africa, minus Eswatini that doesn't recognize the PRC. But in the Middle East, you have a set of institutions. You have the China Arab States Cooperation Forum, which is with the League of Arab States members. You have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has Turkey as a dialogue partner, not a full member, but you also have Iran going through the process of joining as a full member. And then Israel is not encompassed within either of those organizations. And arguably China downplays some of its relations with Israel because of the concerns from other countries in the region. So that would be the kind of main differences that I would highlight between the two regions. But I do think it's incredibly important to keep in mind that the interests and the vast majority of foreign policy tools that are utilized are very similar.
Yeah, thank you so much for this thorough response to that. Yes, you know, maybe shifting gears a little bit from this, although it's still connected to this, I would say maybe Beijing's ability to, I guess, to mediate in a way or to conduct foreign policy that is able to balance between, you know, like you said a little bit ago, like Palestine and Israel, and also Iran and Saudi Arabia. It just sort of gives Beijing this very, very specific ability to play, you know, or have solid, strong relations with parties that don't necessarily sort of see eye to eye in that way. So connecting to that, sort of my question is about Chapter 5, which I found to be, you know, extremely illuminating. Chapter 5 for our listeners is titled "A Responsible Power" with a question mark, but it's about China's special envoys, sort of the conducting diplomacy through special envoys for the Middle East, Syria, and Africa. And here, my question is sort of in the opening of this chapter, you sort of say that the special envoy's task is primarily to make sure that China's interests, which you've outlined for us in an earlier response, that include sort of domestic stability, domestic economic growth, international support or support in international arenas, and so on and so forth, are safeguarded. And we have seen a few months ago, in fact, in June of this summer, 2022, Beijing kind of brokered, co-hosted a peace conference with the countries in the Horn of Africa, with Ethiopia and Kenya. And so, you know, there was a lot of publicity around this peace conference. There were, I guess, lots of maybe before the conference took place, lots of, you know, kind of optimism and hopes that China would sort of add an edge to the conversation, so that it kind of brought, you know, a concrete stability to the region, the conflict that's going on within Ethiopia, as well as the Horn of Africa, you know, as a broader region. So, but many analysts observed at the end of the peace conference that, you know, that China's mediation efforts, you know, brought little tangible impacts really, and that, you know, that at the end of the day, it was at most a case of sort of increasing China's visibility, and it was kind of reputation points to this kind of responsible power type of argument than it was really showing up as a successful kind of mediation actor. So, you know, what's your take on China's mediation efforts from what you've observed in the way that China handles its relations, both being kind of with, you know, conducting relations with Israel and Palestine, with Saudi Arabia, Iran, with other countries as well, in a way that sort of, you know, showcases the sort of kind of diplomacy, and you know, is this viewed as being successful in the eyes of officials from host countries that you may have talked to?
Great. So I'll talk about the three envoys that were discussed in the book, because I think each one has different answers to that question. So in relation to the Middle East, the 2002 is when the envoy was set up for Middle East issues, which from I won't go into all the details. Obviously, there's many different aspects of envoys, but that particular one was set up to contribute to Middle East peace process more broadly, right? So it's a long-standing one. It's been around for 20 years. And arguably, the audience for that was Arab states that very much wanted China to play more of a role in that particular conflict. And China historically has seen the Arab-Israeli and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as the core of potential conflict more broadly in the region. So they see it as an incredibly important security issue that they want to have resolved, and they want to contribute to that. But I think to date, the vast majority of success of that has been China, as you said, demonstrating that it's a balanced actor, that it's willing to talk to various parties, it attempts to bring them together, it tries to understand the situation. But as we all know, that peace has not been achieved yet, right? So if the success would be resolution of the conflict, that has not occurred. But most of that has been to demonstrate to Arab states that China cares about that issue and wants to contribute. The Africa envoy that was established in 2007 is a bit different in that originated around concerns about Darfur. So if you think about in the run-up to the 2008 Olympics, there was a lot of international pressure on China about what was happening in Darfur. And arguably they set up that envoy. The audience for that, I think, was much more the West and the US and the international community to demonstrate that China would attempt to provide some assistance in resolving that conflict. Obviously, Darfur over time went away as an issue, was resolved in various ways. That envoy over time actually took on other issues. So dealing with South Sudan, for example, when South Sudan declared independence, from Sudan, and other issues. So if you look at it as kind of an Africa envoy issue more broadly and not just focused on Darfur, I think it has been successful in demonstrating, again, China's interest in these issues, in getting China's message out, in demonstrating a willingness to try to bring various parties together when there are conflictual situations. Syria was a much more specific envoy that had some different origins. So the Syrian envoy they set up because they were worried about the Syrian conflict overflowing into the region. They were worried about insurgency groups within Syria that potentially could be providing material support to Uyghurs within Xinjiang. They wanted to be able to contribute in the longer term to humanitarian efforts and to reconstruction of the country. And so as a result, that envoy has participated in the various peace processes. So I don't think you could say that China has helped to bring peace to Syria, but they had very tangible interests for wanting to be involved in those discussions. And I do think that a lot of setting up that envoy was partially to address some concerns that earlier the stance that China was taking in the UN Security Council with the double vetoes with Russia appearing to be obstructionist. This gave them a different avenue to demonstrate that they wanted to actually contribute to a positive result in the longer term in Syria. So I think all of these, they're very long-term projects. As you said, there's another envoy that was set up this year. This is likely a foreign policy tool they will continue to use. But I think you have to think about each one. What were the objectives and what has the reaction been? And for each one, it was very different audiences that were in mind.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. And it's, yeah, as you said, we'll have to see again how, the envoy for the Horn of Africa, basically what in the next few months to years, what the initiatives will look like and what the results, will look like for that. So I would be remiss not to ask a question about, practicality of research and fieldwork research, given just the amount of field work you have done for the book. So is it 13 countries or how many?
It's something like that.
It's something like
Around
that.
that.
Yes,
I'd have to
yes.
count, yeah.
And it's like you say in the book, over 200 interviews. So it's a very impressive number of interviews and a long time spent in the field. And it's very important as well for kind of for scholarship on China, Global South relations to bring up about this sort of evidence-based research. And in that way, I wanted to ask if you had thoughts on the current state of doing fieldwork on China studies these days, and if you had any advice for any potential PhD students, early career scholars who might be kind of thinking about, again, turning the dissertation into a book and needing to finish up some fieldwork research, or study in China while not being able to do so much fieldwork right now. So, what are your thoughts on these things? If you have any advice for potential scholars?
Right. So first, I should say I am hopeful that all of us will be able to go back to China soon and do some research. And so please don't lose hope in that. And even though the space for really robust research has become smaller over the years, I do think it still is incredibly beneficial to sit down with scholars and with academics and with interview subjects in China when we can do that again. But to your point, that is right now not possible because of COVID and has become challenging in various ways. So I think depending on what you're researching China in third countries is incredibly important. So whether that's going to Morocco and researching China's presence there, or South Africa or the UAE. So there's a lot that can be done for interviewing, for interacting in those regions. One thing that I did in my own research was in Beijing, I reached out to all of the Middle Eastern and African embassies. I actually did it by fax at the time because it was the most effective way to reach out to the embassies then. But I was actually able to secure a number of ambassador level and deputy chief of mission level interviews with countries that were represented in Beijing. And you can do similar type of activities if you're in DC, if you're in the United Arab Emirates, if you're in London. That would be one avenue, because increasingly the relationship between countries and China is becoming important in a way. Often diplomats and other individuals are starting to have more opinions and more that they can offer you from a content standpoint in that way. There also may be opportunities to meet with Chinese scholars and other interviewees in third countries through other avenues. But I would just say be creative. And I don't think it's as effective to do Zoom interviews, but if Zoom is all you have, I've had a number of PhD students, from Hong Kong and from other places reach out to me via Zoom, and that's great. I mean, I think that everyone is becoming more used to operating in that environment. So if that's all you have, go for it and just be as creative as you can.
Yeah, definitely. This is very solid advice. Definitely be flexible and try. I mean, and we're all hopeful that we'll be able to go back to doing field work. It's not just also China, right? So because of COVID, it's also other areas, and of course because of the unequal distribution of an access to vaccine, you're not able to do. For instance, I've had fieldwork research in Kenya that's just been kind of being delayed year after year, not because I cannot technically travel, but because, of other ethical considerations of, access and equity of vaccine distribution. One is just not able to just kind of pack and go, do the fieldwork that we were taken for granted for so long. So I guess, yes, definitely keeping sort of a perseverance and keeping creative are very strong, solid advice from you, Don. Thank you. So, again, here maybe closing out, it might be our last question here, but, in a way forward-looking, as you show in the book, Don, promoting domestic economic development is extremely important for China's own interests, and it's also important in explaining China's going out strategy and understanding its increasing footprint in the global south. But as you have probably been seeing recently, there have been kind of reports about China's domestic economic slowdown currently, and also projections about the next kind of quarter in terms of economic slowdown. So what is your reading of the impact of this potential economic slowdown in China, sort of domestic economic slowdown on China's foreign policy making in the future? So will, a likely scenario of slowdown impact China's outreach to regions that are of, I guess, lesser strategic interest, or do you think we will continue to see a steady growth in China's engagement in Africa and the Middle East?
So I would say that starting in 2016 with Xi Jinping's capital controls, you started globally to see less Chinese investment abroad. And as you said, the economic slowdown, you're starting to see that globally in various regions. And then COVID just further amplified that. That said, so you see this going down, and I think you'll continue that, but I think you'll see two areas of change. One is what we've seen during COVID is an emphasis on some other areas. So whether that's the health Silk Road, the digital Silk Road, space cooperation. So moving a bit away from some of the traditional infrastructure and investment to other functional areas that I think China's involvement in that way will grow and grow. And also as relations between the US and China and Europe, as they continue to deteriorate and sour, you could make the argument that even if China's global economic interaction decreases, these regions of Africa and the Middle East will become even more important. So you may start to see a shifting of investment, a shifting of economic activity more broadly away from the West and towards these regions. And I would say the Middle East is particularly important for this. Look at the UAE, look at Saudi, look at other countries. But Sub-Saharan Africa also is an incredibly important, globally arena for Chinese investment and economic interaction more broadly. So I think it could pull either direction.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who have made today's interview possible. We hope that those who have tuned in found the interview both interesting and informative, and that you'll join us again for future National Committee programming. Thank you all again.